So I'm Elin, I'm Head of Design at Ministry of Justice, and we're really excited to be here today to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Ministry of Justice, because I think very often people think we just do form and we digitize stuff, which we also do, but there is so much more exciting stuff that we actually care about and work on at the Ministry of Justice. And I have with me Jack, who's my partner in crime.
So I head up teams which work with policy teams in the Ministry of Justice and include designers as well.
Great, so just to put the context, what we do at the Ministry of Justice is mainly protecting the people. We also have a huge, is this me doing this or? We have a huge backlog of work that we're trying to get through to digitize the system so that we're up to speed with how we present our services to the public. And to do that, we have near 20 cross-functional teams, and they are spread across London and Sheffield. They sit in digital and technology, and they have every kind of capability you can think of. Design, research, delivery, product management, and also tech, of course. So very often we hold these type of workshops. We now are really trying to get service design thinking into the work we do. So this is an example of a service map that we've done just to detail a little bit about the different kinds of touch points that we work on across the criminal journey. It's a bit too small for you to see, I recognize, but in a nutshell, what we think about is what happens before crime. How does crime happen? So how can we prevent crime? So we try to think of services that can help us avoid people becoming criminals. We look at things like arrest, what happens in the arrest, and what's the need of the police and to document evidence. We look at the prison experience, what is a prisoner's first 2 weeks and what is their lifetime if they spend a lifetime in there. What happens to them, or what needs to happen to them for them to rehabilitate, and also how do we let people out on trials. And also, of course, there are other things we worry about: legal aid, people divorcing, how do we support people in a difficult life situation. So just to give you a flair of some of the more kind of in the now type of projects that we're doing, I'm going to talk you through Send Money to Someone in Prison, which is a project that one of our team has been working on for a while. You might think, well, why do prisoners need money in a prison? Isn't everything provided for them? But actually it isn't. And you don't often get the opportunity to pack a bag with your most kind of treasured belongings to bring into prison when you go in. So one of the challenges is that it takes a really, really long time for people to get their footing when they are experiencing this. Things like toothpaste is not that easy to get. You need to pay for these things. You need to pay for cigarettes, snacks, and so on. And that might not be available for you when you're there for the first days. And that took, in the past, nearly 14 days if you ask your family or your friends if they could send you some money. And that's a massive issue because you can imagine that has a huge impact on the emotional well-being of a prisoner, that they're sitting there, they don't have access to the basics. The kind of reason for that taking so long is what you see on the screen. I get really exhausted just by looking at it. There's so many touch points and there are so many opportunities here for this to go wrong and for this to be delayed going in to prison. That has a massive effect on prisoners, and also that means that their ability to rehabilitate is kind of diminished because they have such a poor experience coming in. So they start borrowing money from other prisoners to cover their basic needs, which means that they sometimes end up feeling isolated. They get anxious when they can't pay back. There is bullying going on, there is tension and so on, which sets them up really badly for the time that they are going to spend in the prison. So what we did was that we took that process online and we made it really, really simple. We created a system where families and friends could easily transfer money online, and we used the GDS service guidelines and patterns to do this. And that led to a reduced timeline. So you can see now there's only 1 day it takes on average for that money to hit the bank account of the prisoners in prison. So that's a dramatic difference, and it really, really is meaningful because again, it's like you have no idea what it's like to sit in this prison, and it's for a long time. Some people don't even know for how long they're there. And that really affects how they think about themselves and what they're capable of doing. But it's not just the emotional well-being, it's also the cost to society. So that process per transaction in the past cost £5.73, which is quite a lot. And afterwards, after we clean it up, it's now £2.20. So that, you can imagine, taxpayers' money saved and also money that we can use on other services that's going to help the public. But, of course, it's not just digital.
And that's where I'm going to take over.
Yeah.
So, yeah, as Elin says, we're not just trying to digitise existing touch points, we're also trying to think about the future, and actually we're starting to embed design thinking into the very heart of the way the Ministry of Justice thinks, which is really interesting. So these are the kind of big problems in which we're kind of embedding design thinking. So our prison capacity is basically reached, and that has big implications for new prisoners because the quality of service is going to be lower, but also for society because if we can't put people in prison, there's a risk to people in the community. So we ask our policy teams, how do we solve that? And we've started to now ask the service designers, how do we solve that as well? Because essentially this is a service and it's failing. One way to solve that is to kind of sentence people differently or to prevent crime ever occurring. That's great, but it could take a very long time to achieve that. So we're also asking people to look at quick wins within the system. And that's quite hard, but our team identified this thing called home detention curfews, which isn't a cool brand of trainer, it's actually that geotag on the ankle. So we can release prisoners early, and we can keep them in a controlled environment by geotagging them, knowing where they are at certain times of day, and having stipulations about what they can do. So we could release more prisoners on a home detention curfew, is what we thought. But when we looked at that process, we found that of all the people who are eligible to be released on home detention, so to be released early with kind of a tag, only 20% of people annually are actually released. So this is a process and service which simply isn't working how the MOJ intended it to when it was designed. So this is where the team got involved, and this is where the team really targeted their efforts. And this is one of our nicer looking prisons, Berwyn. They don't all look that romantic. But the team went out to prisons across the country, big ones, small ones, different categories. Some which were good at releasing prisoners on home detention, some that weren't so good at it, to understand the process. And to do that, they spoke to offender managers, they spoke to personal officers, they spoke to case admins, and they spoke to offenders themselves as well, as part of a kind of structured process. And this was the outcome after about 8 weeks of doing that research in context. Again, this is a very big process map, so if you work in the Ministry of Justice, you get used to big maps because it's so complex. But it basically lays out the process that from the start and end of someone being released on a home detention curfew. And we mapped against that the pain points as well. And what the kind of pain points that people come across are things, they could be cultural, so different prisons have different attitudes towards home detention. Some prisons, for example, think about it as a privilege, not a right. But also some of it's very basic process stuff. So you as a prisoner have to apply to be released on home detention curfew. But if the letter and information never arrives to you, then that's going to be quite hard to do. And actually we found that happens quite a lot because prisoners move around wings and prisons, and we're not necessarily tracking that very effectively, and we're often sending that stuff by paper post as well. So when we identify these multi-channel kind of solutions, what we're going to do next is co-design the solutions to those with stakeholders and actors, and then very quickly deliver alphas and betas into the system to try and alleviate that pressure. I think it's a really good example of the kind of work that our service designers are doing now, which is right at the heart of the Ministry of Justice's priorities. So I said that we're now solving big problems, but what about this for a big problem? So we know that 69% of young people sentenced to custody reoffend within a year. So it's not just that they reoffend within a year. The youth custody system is a system that's supposed to rehabilitate children and give them better life chances than before they were put into custody. But clearly, it's a service that's not working very effectively. And that's quite a challenge because those users have got really complex needs. So 40% are BAME, 33% at least have mental health needs, and 45% have learning and communication difficulties. Those are really, really complex needs that we're asking our designers and policy teams to work with. And the way we're going to solve that is we're going to approach it in exactly the same way that we approached home detention curfews. So the team's just started getting running, and they're going to go out to youth offending institutions, they're going to talk to the actors surrounding youth offenders, and they're going to talk to youth offenders themselves to understand again where the system's working and where it's not working. And we've got some hunches already, so we're going to dive into areas around health, education and safety. And out of that, we're hoping to identify the opportunities to improve the life chances of those young offenders.
So, on to the big questions that we have. How will crime change in the future? I don't think any of us really know, but we're all trying to be ahead of the curve to understand what it is that we need for skills and what it is that might, change in society. One of the most common cases in court is traffic offences, and that is something that takes an enormous amount of time. But is that going to change when we get driverless cars? Will it be more complex or will it be easier? And how can we as designers design a system that is going to be easy for the courtrooms to evidence and use the logic and use all the data that we get from the cars to affect blame?
Equally, we've got cybercrime is on the rise, so 40% of all crime in the UK is now online, and 1 in 10 adults will be a victim of cybercrime within a year, and that's a big problem for the justice system and the criminal justice system. So most of that's economic crime, but there's a small proportion of it which is actually really serious kind of political crime, which can aim to undermine our kind of political society. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that in the news. And in the Ministry of Justice, it's our responsibility to design a system and a criminal justice system that can respond to that. So you can see a picture of a courtroom basically as it looks now, which is very paper-based, it's in situ, it's in a place, and it's very traditional. It hasn't changed very much in the last 100, 200 years, actually. But we need to start designing a system that can respond to the changing nature of crime. So we need to ask questions like, how can we investigate and gather online evidence and present it to a court? How do we prosecute criminals in non-geographic spaces? How do we prevent online crime ever occurring? And how do we rehabilitate criminals who've committed online crimes? It's a very different set of needs and a very different set of questions to what we're used to dealing with.
Yeah, and so the designers that we have in our team, and really everyone who is doing service design, they really have to understand what the future is going to be. So they have to be researching, investigating the sociological factors that are all in our context for now and might happen in the future. We need to know about the trends, the new technologies that's coming in, and be really up to speed with how we can apply that to our projects to really be on the forefront of serving justice. So that means that our biggest challenge is to adapt our skill sets. we've come so far that when I first started out as a designer, it was very simple. We were digitizing stuff, we were putting brochures online, and then we had e-commerce, and then we had social platforms, and then things got, you know, wider and wider and wider. So the skill sets that the designers and our teams have is something that we are continuously concerned about, and we continuously try to evolve.
And to add to that as well, we're asking our designers to work in new contexts and in new materials. So we're asking them to understand things like legislation, we're asking them to work with ministers, we're asking them to work in bigger complex systems and with very vulnerable complex users as well.
Yeah, so and to do that, we've put designers into policy teams. And in the policy teams, we have them use prototyping techniques to work in a standard or more traditional policy environment, which is quite new and also quite effective. So one of the examples is a major life event that most of us actually will go through at some point, which is divorce, which is traumatic for people, but it's even more traumatic for kids. So how can we help parents understand the options that are available to them to be able to solve that problem that they have in the best possible way for their family? The most obvious example is just to go to court and get custody arrangements. But is that really the best way to take care of your kids going forward when you split and go two different ways? That's what we're trying to help families understand what other options are available to them.
So the challenge to our designers that we've got is how can we design a system which encourages people to use the most appropriate option for them, or the best option for them and their family, rather than just the most obvious option, the one they know most about, which is often court. And those users, again, they've got really, really complex needs that lead them to go to court. A lot of them don't have information about it. But actually, a fair proportion of them are probably quite vulnerable. So they may have been victims of domestic violence and abuse in the past. They might not be able to afford a lot of alternatives. And they might not be emotionally ready to make an arrangement with their ex-partner, as you can imagine. But equally, as designers, we can't just go into a court and run an experiment with these people because of the risk of getting it wrong. If we get it wrong somewhat with an experiment, someone literally might not see their kids again. So there's really high stakes that we're kind of working with. So we've kind of we've adapted what we do, and we've taken different approaches to it. So when we prototype solutions, we do it in a lab first. We co-create with experts, and we work with professionals as well to make sure what we do is safe. So this is an example of where the team built a prototype tool to give people personalised information about their situation. So you put in some information about yourself and you get an answer of what you could do next back. As you can imagine, that's quite complex. So the team built a human algorithm, and what you can see there is a researcher in the lab with a parent who's separating a developer and a designer in the background, building the answer to that algorithm. But to do that, we co-created those answers with professionals and experts. And during this testing, we had someone from Women's Aid available as a wraparound for the testing to make sure we were supporting the people who were going through the tests as well. And this is what the kind of output looked like for that human algorithm. And by doing it, we learned loads of stuff, and we were able to influence the way policy and service design was being thought about. So we learned that people weren't actually very good at disclosing their circumstances. And the researcher had to do a lot of work to decode body language and ask follow-up questions that an online tool couldn't really do very effectively, or certainly that we couldn't develop very quickly and deliver into a system. So ultimately the prototype failed, but it informed our next steps. So the team is now working on a face-to-face pilot in a court with social workers running a face-to-face service.
So I hope you've seen that we're not just digitizing the justice system, we're really working on some really challenging and also deeply emotional problems in society. And it's for that reason that we think that the government actually has the more complex issues to solve in the future going forward. And I think it is the best place, if you are a service designer or a researcher or any capability, to be part of something meaningful going forward to hone your skills. So yeah, that's it from us. Thank you so much for listening.